My Lords, I rise to speak on Amendment 47 in the name of the noble Baroness Miller, and I speak as a landlord of rental properties in Norwich as declared on the register. Now, naturally, we should consider the rights of people who own companion animals, but that must go hand in hand with the rights of a landlord who may be concerned about damage to his property, and the rights of neighbouring residents who may have to deal with the consequence of noise, mess, smell, and so forth. And once again, there is a balance to be struck, but this amendment strikes the wrong balance, in my view. Look, it's obvious that keeping a pet elevates the risk of damage, and especially in the case of furnished accommodation. And this bill contemplates that all tenancies are the same. Well, there are different sorts of properties. And in a furnished accommodation, of course, the consequences of damage are higher. It fails to recognise the reality of different types of accommodation, whether they be period or listed, or of some historic or archaeological merit for whom it's incompatible with pets in the building. There are often circumstances where, particularly in blocks of flats, there are communal amenities, for example, common courtyards or gardens, often where children play. And all of these are different to the detached rented home in the countryside, where there's much more space to jam about. And this bill contemplates a one-size-fits-all, regardless of furnished, unfurnished, countryside or flats, all the different types of properties one may wish to tenant. Now, it's absolutely reasonable, in my view, for a landlord to refuse to allow a large dog in a small flat, where there's no outside space. A confined animal just doesn't chew, although they do. They bark, they upset the neighbours, and the needs of neighbours must be considered. This bill is all about the tenant, and I can understand that that's important. But it's to the exclusion of any other stakeholder, and that cannot be right. The landlord must make the judgment and take into account whether the applicant, perhaps a night shift worker with a large dog, is suitable for his property. Now, I will concede that there is a world of difference between the different types of pets: goldfish, spiders, dog, cats and ferrets. May I be the first to introduce the second reading, for having just heard the first reading of that particular bill. But we'll make those distinctions with the chewing variety. And, just to call pets, we're denying the obvious distinction between 2 legs, 4 legs, 100 legs, no legs, fishy ones with scales and so forth. There are different types of animal, and they're all contained within this catch-all that cannot make sense. My Lords, there is one point where I do agree on Amendment 47, and it's in little a, where it reveals that the personal opinion of the tenant the tenant should not form predisposed opinions of the tenant. And I agree with that, but not in the way you might think. Now, I once had the chief executive of a county council as a tenant. My Lords, her cat ate my sofa. The white polyester fluff was everywhere. I didn't know where the cat ended and the sofa began. And these things happen. But my point is, however well-heeled or fragrant that particular tenant might have been, she had no control over the pet whatsoever. And it's really important that we consider that the pet is the one who potentially has the damage, not the tenant. Because this lady worked long hours, travelled widely, she wasn't there, and the chewing cat rather, was incompatible with her lifestyle, and my furnished apartment took the consequences. Now, let's move on. This bill contemplates that the tenant with a pet has that pet at the outset. But the bill, nor this amendment, adequately takes into account the possibility of a tenant who may acquire a pet during the tenancy, or somehow mendaciously mislead as to the nature of an existing pet, or even hide it away altogether. And I do think that when we're considering pets, and it's probably a bit too late because it's in Clause 4, which was done last week, but I think we have to contemplate that insofar as pets, if there is willful misdescription, it does amount to a breach of contract. Now, I have no intent to be overbearing or heavy-handed, but these are the examples where the rights of the tenant must coexist with the neighbours there. And let me explain. I've got another case, at the moment actually, of a tenant who repeatedly allows his small dog to urinate against the wall in the communal courtyard. It's damaging the brickwork, which is for my account, but it's really unpleasant for the kids because it's the only place for them to securely play away from the traffic that passes outside. And that's just not really, fair on everybody. So look, I've mentioned the distinction between the goldfish and the Staffordshire Terrier, between the spider and the snake, and whilst I'm not scared of spiders or snakes, some are, and of course one of the clauses in the bill is about predispositions towards certain sorts of animals. And scaredness is a different sort of cat completely, the scaredy cat. And it may well be that it is quite right and proper that those people with a predisposition against those sort of animals are protected there. Look, I regret to say that the Noble Lady's Amendment is well-meaning, but it doesn't live in the real world. The real world between the differences of location, different properties, different furnishings, different types of animal, fur or feather, and the neighbours. And these aren't examples that are grounded in prejudice. They're grounded in the balanced welfare of all residents. And the landlord has a role to act to arbitrate in everyone's benefits, and I'm afraid I cannot support 47. I make no comment on 48. Once again, I remind of my register of interest in that I'm a landlord. Baroness Miller, I just wonder if I might just dwell before supporting 53A most strongly. And I'm looking around this chamber, when most of us travel a lot as part of our duties in this house if we live outside London. And I'm sure my wife would be the first to complain if I brought bed bags back to our family home. Now, drawing on my experience, not just as a landlord, but also as a managing agent, I know the costs of this bill will be that the additional costs, and Lord de Clifford has enumerated them most ably, the additional costs of damage, wear and tear, fluff, cleanliness, pest control, and all those other little things, will, particularly in blocks of flats, be borne by those tenants who do not keep pets. And I just don't think that's right, because quite simply keeping a pet is an add-on to a tenancy, and the additional cost could be borne by those people who bring the pets with them. There are lots of examples where things can go wrong, and I'd like to give you an example in my own lived experience with a tenant who declared he didn't own any pets at all. In due course, he brought his 2 large dogs to the property, where he left them whilst he went to work, and by it became clear that my house was being used as a kennel. And not only were the neighbours disturbed by the all-day and all-night barking, and by the time the tenant had stopped paying rent and I took proceedings, £15,000 worth of damage was caused. When he finally left, I discovered the most foul-smelling, revolting scene, where one bedroom had been used as a doggy lavatory for weeks. It would have been even worse had the proposals to stop reclaim action, repossession action, would extend for 8 to 13 weeks. Now, this was a gross case in every respect. However, and so I was lucky in that case, because the sum of money was so large, to get an insurance claim on that. But that's not what we're talking about generally in this bill. We're concerned not about Granny, who may be infirm, as Baroness Miller sort of implied, chewing the table leg and causing damage that way, or eating the carpet. What we're thinking is that sort of middling bit, where it's above and beyond the 3 weeks. And I totally agree with my noble friend Lord Howard, that the additional 3 weeks isn't enough, but I accept we've got to fight the battles we can win, and if that's as good as we can, I think it's a proportionate compromise which I'm prepared to accept. Now, several noble lords have mentioned that, and I agree with this, by the way, that, well, of course, if the pet doesn't cause any damage, well, the tenant gets the deposit back in full with interest. And I would just like to place on the record that in the statutory schemes, deposit protection schemes, interest is not normally paid. The deposit goes in, and the costs of interest are retained by the deposit scheme, presumably to defray their costs of operating the system and the administration. But I wouldn't want people watching this outside this chamber to think that we were going to now introduce the requirement to pay interest if indeed the landlord doesn't accept that. So look, what I'm thinking is, and I've listened carefully to what the noble Baroness, the Minister, said, that the ability exists for the government to increase the deposit through the Tenant Fees Act 29. But I think we should just accept here and now, and Amendment 53 sort of implies that there are additional costs and risks for keeping pets, and we should not wait for that. It's so obvious. We shouldn't necessarily wait. Let's have those provisions within the Tenant Fees Act 2019 introduced immediately, proportionately, so the goldfish isn't charged at the same rate as the new fee. I mean, that would be sensible. And then particularly with in the cases where there's furnished accommodation as well. And then I think that we can have a good compromise that everybody can live with. And finally, and I don't really want to repeat at length, but I do believe that if we can come to that arrangement, then it benefits the tenant by having that deposit rather than pay, because at least they get that back. Whereas in the case if they have to buy a premium an insurance policy, not that these policies exist, as the noble Lord Canil has said, that would be an absolute cost because they would pay whether there was damage or not. So I strongly support 53, and if the noble Lord is minded to test the opinion of the House, I will be following him through the lobby.